Good evening, everybody, or good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Welcome from the Scotland Stoics. Tonight we are joined by Donald Robertson. It's great to see you again. Donald Robertson requires no introduction in the Stoic community, but for the benefit of those who are new to the topic, let me just say a few words about Donald. Donald Robertson is a world-renowned Scottish Stoic from Ayrshire, so we can claim him as a Scottish Stoic. In addition to devoting over 2 decades to the study and application of Stoicism, and being a best-selling author in Stoicism, for example, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. He's also a cognitive behavioral therapist and a fellow of the Royal Society for Public Health. He's one of the founding members of modern Stoicism, the author of the original Stoic Week, which I'm sure many of you have completed, and he's also the founder of Plato's Academy. So we're delighted to have you back, and I look forward to our discussion on Socrates.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to it. It's not that often that I get the chance to do things in Scotland, but it's like a treat for me, like to be able to speak to people in Scotland. Apart from one exception, I did an interview, unusually, which I think is coming out quite soon in the Sunday Post newspaper in Scotland, like in the next week or so.
We'll be looking forward to it. Yes, we certainly need to spread the Stoic gospel in Scotland as well. So last time we talked about Marcus Aurelius, and tonight we'll be going a little bit further back in time to Socrates. So why don't we start by exploring that connection between Socrates and Stoicism, which perhaps often doesn't receive as much as attention as it deserves in the Stoic community or in general. So most of your books focus on Stoicism, and in some of your earlier works, such as The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, you already allude to your interest in Socrates and also to this Stoic exercise of the contemplation of an ideal sage, which to the Stoics was largely influenced by, if not synonymous with Socrates, especially for Epictetus. And then we have the very founder of Stoicism, which got inspired by Xenophon's Memorabilia. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about the connection between the Socratic thought and Stoicism and how these two relate to one another?
Well, as is often the case with ancient texts, there's some disagreement about this and there's some ambiguity. And it might be that the Stoicism flourished for 500 years as a living tradition in the ancient world. And we know of about 60 or 70 famous, not just Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, there are at least 60 or 70 famous Stoic authors and teachers that we hear about in the ancient world. So they had different opinions. In fact, another bit of trivia for you, we're told that at several points in its history, Stoicism fragmented into separate branches. Actually, very early on, like maybe during the lifetime or immediately after the death of Zeno, the Stoic school split into two different factions, Cleanthes and Aristo's faction. And then towards the end, it split into three main branches in the Roman world, and so those branches probably had slightly different interpretations. I think to some extent we can see that in Epictetus, for example, and Seneca, although in a sense they're saying the same things, like there's clearly different characters and their emphasis and way of communicating Stoicism is clearly quite different. And one example of that is Seneca lists his role models, the philosophers that he's most influenced by in one of his letters. And he lists, if I remember right, Zeno and Cleanthes, but not Chrysippus, curiously. But he also lists Plato, which is a little bit surprising because Zeno's Republic was a critique of Plato's Republic. So there was always the Stoics and the Platonists were kind of frenemies, like there's some common ground and some tension between them. But Seneca is one of those Stoics who kind of leans towards Platonism. Whereas Epictetus is more critical of the Platonic tradition, and he loves the Cynics. and he clearly greatly admires Diogenes the Cynic as one of his main role models, where Seneca doesn't list any cynics among his role models. So it could be Epictetus and Seneca represent two branches of Stoicism, one that's a bit more old school and leans more towards the cynics, one that's a little bit more kind of progressive, more eclectic, and leans a bit more towards the Platonists and maybe the Aristotelians as well. But both of them admire Socrates as one of their main role models. And in fact, Seneca says repeatedly and emphatically to his students that they should attempt to emulate Socrates. They should ask themselves what Zeno or Socrates would do in a particular situation. He mentions Socrates, I think, if I remember rightly, twice as often as he mentions Zeno when he's talking to his students. That's quite striking. Like he goes on more about Socrates. You might think, "I'm sure you're not like a Socratic rather than a Stoic. Like you talk more about Socrates." Um, the other thing that's notable about it is, our two main sources for information about Socrates are the Socratic dialogues of Plato, of course, but we also have about 40 shorter dialogues from Xenophon, a slightly older student of Socrates, who's a famous Athenian general. People sometimes forget about that. We have quite a large collection of Socratic dialogues from Xenophon. Well, the Stoics are perhaps more interested in Xenophon's portrayal, or at least roughly equally interested in Xenophon's portrayal. In fact, we're told that when Zeno first arrived in Athens and he was disheveled and supposedly he'd lost everything, he found himself at a bookseller's stall and he began reading the second book of the Memorabilia Socratis by Xenophon. And in that book, it contains a famous speech, which we call the Choice of Hercules, which is an exhortation to become a philosopher. Like Socrates repeats the speech that he's learned from Prodicus, one of the sophists, and he puts a Socratic spin on it. So Zeno says that he read this speech that was written down by Xenophon that Socrates is relating, that's meant to inspire people to follow a life of philosophy. And that's what he then did. That was what caused him to decide that he was going to go off and embrace the study of philosophy. So you could even say that it was a Socratic dialogue that is responsible for inspiring the founder of the Stoic school in the first place. But certainly Epictetus is emphatic about this, and some of our other sources say that the Stoics considered themselves, at least some Stoics considered themselves to be a Socratic sect as a sort of offshoot of Socrates. Now, I guess one thing that's worth saying is that the like I said, there's like a tension between the Stoics and Plato. I would imagine that the Stoics probably viewed themselves as going back to the original teaching of Socrates prior to some of the things that the Platonic school added. The most obvious thing being that Plato portrays in most of his dialogues Socrates describing the theory of forms, this metaphysical theory, and the Stoics have no interest in that. They are pantheists and corporealists. They don't believe in Plato's metaphysics, but they probably didn't think Socrates believed in that stuff either, and that might be why they lean more towards Xenophon's Socrates, who doesn't mention anything resembling the theory of forms. So we think of the Stoics, we think of Socrates often mainly as what we see in Plato's Republic and so on. The Stoics probably saw Socrates in a slightly different way and were wanting to kind of get back to the original Socrates more.
Well, thank you. That was a really great introduction to the next question, which I had about these different sources that we can use to learn more about Socrates. Because with Marcus Aurelius, we had so much information
Yeah,
at our disposal. With Socrates, we're a bit more limited because virtually none of Socrates' writings survive except for very, very tiny fragments of his poem, I believe.
yeah.
So I was wondering how do you tackle that question of who Socrates was as a historical person versus Socrates as a sort of more of a literary construction in Plato, and whether you see Socrates of Xenophon as a slightly different, maybe slightly more pragmatic, if
Uh-huh.
that would be accurate, for, at least from my reading of Xenophon, it seemed that it was a slightly more down to earth Socrates than with
Yeah,
Plato.
I think that's fair. I think what you're describing is what scholars call the Socratic problem, which is the difficulty of separating Socrates from Plato, basically, philosophically, and in terms of his biography as well. So Plato represents Socrates in most of his dialogues. They're kind of like plays a bit. We see him interacting with other famous Athenians or other famous Greeks. We, learn a little bit about the details of his life, and many ideas are attributed to him. Um, and it's very difficult for us to know uh, whether this is historically accurate or whether Plato is making it all up. For example, Robin Waterfield, who recently wrote a biography of Plato, the first full-length English language biography of Plato, he's a highly prolific translator and classicist, thinks that what Plato is writing is basically what he imagines Socrates might have said if he'd had these conversations. So he sees them as largely semi-fictional. Plato, as far as I recall, Plato nowhere claims that he's accurately relating what Socrates said. And in some places he cannot be, because if my recollection is Plato says that he's not present during Socrates' trial because he was ill. So you could infer from that that Plato's Apology, his most famous writing, cannot be a verbatim account of what Socrates said during the trial because Plato wasn't even there. Right. And actually, many of the conversations that he relates would have occurred at a date prior to Plato's acquaintance with Socrates. So, for those and other reasons, it seems like Plato is kind of imagining what he thinks Socrates would say. Now, with Xenophon, it's a bit trickier. Um, Xenophon's dialogues are shorter, sometimes much shorter. So it's more plausible in that regard that they could be an accurate summary of something that Socrates said. Several times, Xenophon claims that he was present and introduces a dialogue by saying that he observed it. So he makes more of a claim to be representing what Socrates said. Some people have doubted that, but I think it's probably more plausible that the real Socrates was doing simpler, more pragmatic philosophy. Most people traditionally are more interested in Plato, like the Stoics, perhaps. I'm quite interested in Xenophon's account of Socrates because, in some ways, it's more we see Socrates doing something that's more like cognitive therapy. Like in several, we see bits of this in Plato, but more obviously so. In Xenophon, we see stuff that resembles cognitive therapy. I'll give you an example. I mean, these are both examples I talk about in my book. And one of them, Socrates' son, Lamprocles, is really annoyed with his mother, Xanthippe. And so Socrates questions him about his anger towards his mum in a way that helps him to overcome his anger and change his perspective on the relationship. It looks like he's doing relationship counseling or some sort of cognitive therapy. It really does. He's not talking about the theory of forms, the nature of the good and stuff like that. He's literally just asking much more down-to-earth questions about anger. And there's another argument that happens between one of Socrates' best friends, Chaerephon, and his younger brother, Chirocrates. And it's kind of implied it's about how they're distributing an inheritance. They have a big falling out. And so Socrates talks to Chirocrates, the younger brother, about this, and basically again just uses Socratic questioning as a form of cognitive therapy. So that's why I'm particularly interested in Xenophon as a therapist. It really jumps out at me. We also have what's called the anecdotal tradition. So we have like a bunch of anecdotes regarding Socrates, which are generally considered to be a real mixed bag in terms of how reliable they are. Like typically they come from much later authors like Diogenes Laertius. And sometimes the things are attributed to Socrates that are also attributed to like other random philosophers as well. So you know the anecdote about Socrates, Diogenes the Cynic meeting Alexander the Great and saying, "Step out." I mean, I think even in one of our sources, like this is actually attributed to Socrates, which would be impossible, right? So that shows kind of how flaky some of the anecdotes can be. But on the other hand, um, we have quite a lot of dialogues from Plato, about 37, and about 40 short dialogues from Xenophon. In the ancient world, there were many more dialogues. It was said that Socrates had about 10 followers who wrote dialogues. The earliest ones were written by a guy called Simon, the shoemaker, like before Plato or Xenophon began writing theirs, allegedly. And some of them were quite influential. Antisthenes was well known as a thinker in the ancient world. Also, Phaedo, uh, Aeschines were quite prolific writers of Socratic dialogues. It's just a coincidence that we only have Xenophon's and Plato's and a couple other fragments that survive today. But some of the anecdotes maybe derive from some of these other dialogues written by the Socratics or the followers of Socrates. Marcus Aurelius, about 500 years later, um, says things about Socrates, and even like Marcus Aurelius writes down a little mini fragment of Socratic dialogue that does not exist in Plato or Xenophon's dialogues. So either he's confused, he's misquoting it, he's making it up, he's heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy or something like that. It's got like garbled. Or Marcus Aurelius is reading Socratic dialogues that don't exist anymore, like, and has access to literature that was around in the Roman Empire but not around today. So that maybe highlights the fact that the Socrates that the Stoics are talking about is certainly
Mm.
different from the Socrates that we know today. Marcus Aurelius is literally attributing views to him and sayings and discussions that we don't exist anymore. And that, we're not even sure which uh, of the Socrates' followers he's deriving that from. Presumably not Plato. It's like that it's very unlikely to be Plato because we have basically all of Plato's writings. Um, Maybe Antisthenes, perhaps, who knows? Like, unless it's just kind of an anecdote that was made up by a later author that he's quoting.
That, that,
But
that-
yeah, that's kind of the text. And the anecdotes contain some as well, are often overlooked, but they also contain some interesting stuff. So in my book, I don't think I think it's very hard to get back to the original Socrates. One way of doing it is to try and infer what Plato added. Scholars try to do that by putting his dialogues in chronological order and assuming that the earlier dialogues are more faithful to Socrates, and because it seems that we can see a progression where Plato introduces the theory of forms and develops it. There's also a fleeting remark by Aristotle where he says that Plato invented or was the first person to describe the theory of forms, which by definition implies that Socrates never said this because it was Plato's innovation. Um, and it certainly looks like Plato is making the theory of forms up and attributing it to Socrates. So, and what reinforces that is the fact that in none of the other literature does Socrates mention this, and in Xenophon, for example, he doesn't mention it. So, on that basis, if we subtract that and focus more on the earlier dialogues and look at the common ground between Plato and Xenophon, we can try to reconstruct what we think the original Socrates might have looked like. Um, but the other argument is, maybe there are two things here. There's the real Socrates, and then there's the literary character of Socrates. Marcus Aurelius had never met the real Socrates. Like Socrates to Marcus Aurelius was like a figure from ancient history. Like it would be like us talking about someone from the late medieval period, right? So what matters to Marcus Aurelius is the literary character of Socrates. And so in my book, I said, let's set aside the Socratic problem and just clarify what the semi-fictional account of Socrates actually looks like, because this is in part the Socrates that Marcus Aurelius is responding to.
That's really interesting. And what I really like about this book that you wrote, and also your previous books, is that you don't only talk about how that particular school of thought influenced later philosophers, but you also delve into the early sources of inspiration for these philosophers, including Socrates. So could you perhaps enlighten us a little bit about the original inspiration for Socrates, or how he differed from Anaxagoras, and whether there was any common ground, or how did he learn from him, both as an example and counterexample of what it means to be a wise philosopher.
Well, then, like setting aside the question of the real Socrates,
Yes,
because most of what we have to go on is Plato and Xenophon's
yes,
semi-fictional account of him, which is like, let's say it's half true. Um, the way that the tradition tells us that Socrates is portrayed in the dialogues as saying that he originally studied natural philosophy and he purchased books on it. He immersed himself in the subject. The chronology here is tricky because, as far as we can figure out, he must have done this for quite a long time. There's another piece of evidence that I should mention that's often overlooked because it's very frustrating. That everything about Socrates is paradoxical, right? So the only piece of evidence that we have, apart from a few fragments, um, from Socrates' lifetime, because Plato and Xenophon's dialogues were written after he died, the only truly contemporary piece of evidence is a satire by Aristophanes called The Clouds. Socrates is mentioned, we know, in several Greek satires, some of which we have bits of and others we don't. But we have the whole of The Clouds. It was very, very famous. And the way it portrays Socrates is basically nothing like the way that Plato or Xenophon or any subsequent philosopher portrays him. So it's generally assumed that Aristophanes is just really distorting Socrates and caricaturing, which is a little bit problematic because this play was written and performed during Socrates' lifetime, right? So it's quite strange that he would misrepresent him so badly in front of his contemporaries. You'd think the Athenians would go, "This is nothing like so." So what the way that he portrays him is as a kind of hybrid of a natural philosopher and a sophist, basically mashed together, which are two traditions we normally think of Socrates as opposing and criticizing. But it may be that because this was performed um, kind of in the middle of Socrates' philosophical career, let's say, or kind of towards the beginning of it. Um, it may be that earlier in his philosophical development, Socrates was following the sophists more, certainly perhaps more likely following the natural philosophers more and studying them, and that over many, many years, he gradually broke away and developed his own method. So there are many philosophers. I mean, Socrates' significance is illustrated by the fact that we refer to the pre-Socratic philosophers. There's Socrates, and then there's the stuff that happened before and after him.
yes.
I mean,
Like BC, yeah.
like BC and AD or something in philosophy terms. That makes him a pretty big deal. So the philosophers that preceded him actually are quite a mixed bag, but many of them were natural philosophers who are almost in some ways like early proto-scientists. They wanted, like Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras was the first philosopher at Athens. Not the first philosopher ever, but the first philosopher to base himself at Athens. But he traveled to Athens from what would now be modern day Turkey. And so he's a kind of foreigner in a sense. Like he was from a Greek colony. And seemed kind of exotic to the Athenians, and it occupied this strange. So he's an outsider coming in with these strange ideas, right, from the border of the Persian world, maybe influenced to some extent by Persian thought. sort of strange, unusual, radical, kind of controversial ideas, saying that we should describe everything in cause-effect terms, in terms of physical processes, and in a way that's perceived as kind of almost atheistic, like antagonistic to traditional superstition and religion, which is part of what made it controversial. And Anaxagoras was accused of impiety and put on trial for it. The details of that are a little bit foggy, like, but he's believed to have been placed on trial for impiety in a way that foreshadows what subsequently happened to Socrates. Now, one of the main differences is, and this is a little bit puzzling as well. There are many puzzling things about Socrates. So we're generally told by other philosophers that what's unique about Socrates, very simply, was that he took philosophy down from the heavens. So the natural philosophers were very interested in studying the stars and celestial bodies, and so on. For example, Anaxagoras was the one who believed that the sun was a ball of fire or of molten iron, actually. And then in his trial, Socrates is accused of believing that. So again, in the trial, he's kind of mixed up with the natural philosophers more in a way that's a little bit surprising. That's partly, what fuels the accusation of impiety against him. So Socrates was influenced by these guys, but we're told that he took philosophy down from the heavens and applied it to our household, like what goes on under our roof, figuratively. And he became much more interested in applying the dialectical method, the question and answer method, or logic, to ethics, like everyday ethical questions. And we can see that in Plato's dialogues. We see it in Xenophon's dialogues. Earlier philosophers definitely spoke about ethics, but they probably did it in a little bit more of a didactic way, a more conservative way. Whereas what Socrates is really doing is applying this question and answer method, his trademark Socratic method, to ethical questions. He's asking people to critically reflect upon their preconceptions about the nature of courage, the goal of life, what constitutes wisdom, what constitutes justice, and so on, in a way that earlier philosophers probably hadn't. And that's a watershed moment in the history of philosophy. It's the beginning of real ethical philosophy.
Yes, and I think it also shows the difference in how he engages people, often in a somewhat witty and funny way as well. I mean, I remember when you wrote in your book about his conversation with with Euthydemus, where you describe him as a sort of self-help junkie,
Mhm.
which shows us that this phenomenon isn't anything new. And very often his approach was yes, but or trying to use these different sort of tricks or methods that you describe, such as apophases and this method of questioning. So I was wondering how do you see Socrates as a person that can bring us cure for this obsession with
Gosh.
self-help?
I think I'm sort of maybe overly used to reading the Socratic dialogues now, so maybe I'll lose sight of this a little bit because I remember saying it more to people in the past. Um, but I used to say a lot to people, like Socrates probably isn't who you think he is, right? To people who haven't studied philosophy and haven't read the Socratic dialogues, haven't read Plato, I mean, I don't know what they imagine Socrates would be like, but I think they're a little bit surprised that he is so kind of ironic and that it's very hard to pin down. It's also somewhat lost in translation, but overall in the dialogues, you definitely get the sense that Socrates is kind of playing with his interlocutors, and he comes across as quite an odd and multifaceted and complex character. He always seems to be one step ahead of the person that he's speaking to, and there seem to be things going on at multiple levels in the conversation. I mean, it really isn't like reading this Plato's dialogues is more like reading Shakespeare, um, than it would be reading they're the sort of texts that you spend your lifetime studying because there's so much going on, and you might be reading them for years and then one day just suddenly realize that there's something going on in the dialogue that you hadn't even noticed before. um Compared to the type of books that we're used to reading today on philosophy, it would be more like an essay or a lecture, something relatively straightforward. They have a beginning, middle, and an end. Socrates asks questions that sometimes are lead to very inconclusive conversations. Often he clearly seems to be hinting in a particular direction or implying a particular answer. So you can have endless fun trying to kind of uncover uh, what it is he's driving at. And some people find that incredibly frustrating, whereas I think other people find it very liberating. I think at first I found it quite frustrating, and I preferred people just to kind of tell me, their philosophical argument, the conclusion they were aiming for. When I studied philosophy at Aberdeen University when that was my first degree. I wasn't so enamored of Socrates. And then over time, I became more and more drawn to him. One reason that I could use to kind of validate that now is that I very much think that the Socratic method is a process that helps us acquire cognitive flexibility. So what it does is helps us to view a question from many different perspectives. And we now know from research in psychotherapy that that ability is extremely useful. It's associated with emotional resilience and good mental health. Basically, rigid and kind of narrow dogmatic thinking tends to be associated with psychological problems. But this ability to kind of think outside the box, as it were, spot exceptions to generalizations is at first seems kind of amorphous and kind of frustrating, but it's much more important. I think one way of explaining this is that the the sophists, who were kind of quasi-philosophers who preceded Socrates, tended to give lectures and they taught maxims or sayings, wise sayings. That's what Euthydemus is studying. He's got all these books that contain wise maxims, he says. And we have this today in the self-help or self-improvement field. And Socrates thinks, that these kind of sayings he doesn't think they're bad. He actually says he thinks they're valuable. Socrates doesn't really seem to believe that this is what wisdom consists in. He has a much more dynamic conception of wisdom. I put it very simply like this. I think for Socrates, wisdom is more like a cognitive skill rather than a bunch of opinions that you have. You cannot go and buy wisdom like you could go to greengrocers and buy a bag of onions. So you can't just go to a sophist and pay them money and have them tell you their wisdom and you memorize it and then just go and repeat it to other people. Right. Well, Protagoras said da 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 da, and I've memorized it. I'm just regurgitating it. I mean, it's weird because people do this now.
Mm.
Like they'll watch Joe Rogan and or something like that, and they'll kind of like learn stuff, like memorize stuff, and then just kind of repeat it. But Socrates said, well, that way you acquire opinions rather than genuine knowledge. You don't really understand how those conclusions were arrived at, the pros and cons of them. Real wisdom would come from interacting with other people and defending your opinions and questioning them. It's more of a dynamic process or a cognitive skill. And really, I think for Socrates, wisdom consists in the Socratic method, basically, and learning to use something like that, like using what's called also called the dialectic or the question and answer method, becoming really good at that, which makes a lot more sense if you think about it, right?
Yes, absolutely, and you've so nicely tied with modern research on it when you talk about how people have been doing these different experiments on people
Yeah.
being able to achieve cognitive flexibility and being more efficient with what they do and
Maybe I can
yeah.
speak to that a little bit because I think it's so important. I mean, this is state-of-the-art research in psychotherapy to some extent. So there's research that drives what we call third wave or mindfulness and acceptance-based psychotherapy or influences it on what's called rule-governed behavior. And so one of the things that researchers have discovered is that when people are given a verbal rule, like a maxim or a saying, something like that, right? Um, I mean, that could be a good example happens to be the best-selling self-improvement book of our time is literally called 12 Rules for Living or whatever by Jordan Peterson, and literally consists in a bunch of rules for living. They're exactly the sort of thing that we're talking about here. So he says always tell the truth or at least never lie. Boom, there you go. Funnily enough, that's pretty much one of the examples that Socrates criticizes in Xenophon's dialogues, right? So seems like good advice, right? Um, there are other people that give you the opposite advice, but like seems like good advice. It could be um, any number of maxims like that or sayings that we follow in life, but the research what the research shows is that these kind of rules are generalizations and they usually need to be modified to suit the needs of different people in different situations, and they work well until they don't, right? And same with coping strategies. Like you might use mindfulness techniques or relaxation techniques or positive affirmations. They work really well until they don't. Like they often, people who are good at coping do not rely too much on any individual strategy, but the good people who are known to be good at coping have what we call coping flexibility, and they're very adaptive. Like, so they have a toolbox with a variety of different ways of coping with stress, and they choose between them selectively, and then they adapt and modify the coping strategies that they're using to fit different types of situation. The type of relaxation technique that helps you to get to sleep at night might be slightly different from the type of relaxation technique that helps you when you're delivering a wedding speech or that helps you when you're having dental work done, right? So you might need to adjust the maybe you're using a breathing exercise. You probably need to adjust it a little bit for the demands of these different types of situations, right? So someone who's genuinely resilient is good at modifying. They learn in a more trial and error way. Like they experiment with things, right? But what we get from books and lectures is usually generalizations, like in simple formulas. And that's what the Stoics, sorry, the Sophists used to teach people. And I think Socrates' big innovation really was to realize that that was insufficient and that it was our ability to question things and think outside the box that really constitutes wisdom. We know that today. It would be. I'll give you a very simple example of that. I can help people fix this problem fairly easily, right? Uh, Whenever I teach a self-help technique, you might say, or we say a coping strategy in therapy to somebody, usually one of the first things I'll do is draw two columns, write pros and cons or whatever. And I'll say, what do you think of the pros and cons of this mindfulness technique? What do you think would be a good way of doing this and a bad way of doing it? Right? And just beginning to ask yourself those questions and to think through it in a slightly more nuanced way. I suppose in some situations, if I use this mindfulness thing the wrong way, it might make me self-conscious, perhaps. Like, or it might become kind of distracting. Or, so maybe I need to be selective about when I use it. Maybe I need to modify it a little bit. Thinking about it at that level, like, in a more nuanced way, is really what constitutes coping flexibility and emotional resilience. I think the Socratic method gets us much closer to that.
Oh yes, absolutely, and also something that Socrates often criticizes, and I think is also somewhat related to cognitive flexibility, is this argumentum ad populum, that very often he talks about people assuming something is true because a lot of people believe in it, and I wonder, and again, so that really ties with his paradoxical nature, and how do you think that might have shaped his political views when he discussed citizenship with Protagoras, or even the very concept of democracy, which is in many ways based on argumentum ad populum. So,
Yeah.
especially living in Athens, the cradle of democracy, did it create some internal tension for Socrates, or how do you see that part of
Well,
his?
the politics of Socrates is kind of a vexed question as well, right? So there are some people that believe very much, like I.F. Stone, for example, wrote a whole book about how he thought Socrates deserved to be executed, basically, and that he thought Socrates sided politically with the oligarchs. Um, I'm not so convinced by that. And I feel that that book deliberately adopts quite a one-sided perspective. Some people are more convinced of that. For sure, Socrates was a critic of the democracy, right? That doesn't mean to say that he supported the opposing political system, but I think Socrates' focus was slightly different. He doesn't really seem to have a clear preference to me for one political system over another, or one political faction over another. But he thinks that those governing society should be experts. That's pretty clear, right? Now, he thinks that the people who are making decisions that affect society should be virtuous and wise and be able to exercise justice. And so, what we do see is he's often talking to aspiring politicians and questioning their credentials, like Alcibiades, for example, would be the most obvious example. So Socrates, eh, makes Alcibiades aware that as an aspiring politician, he's going to need to know what constitutes justice or what's in the interests of Athenian society. But he highlights the fact that he's never spent any time researching this or studying it. So he really just has preconceptions about it that he wants to impose on the assembly. Like he's never reflected on it or questioned it in any way. And Socrates thinks that he needs to engage in dialectic in order to refine his understanding of justice before he gets up and advises the assembly. He should research it, like question it, study it properly at least. I mean, this is true even today, right? People who are put in charge of different areas of government, are often people who have exhibited zero interest in it in the past. Political candidates have very strong opinions about, foreign policy and, uh, uh, public health and the economy, or sometimes have demonstrated they've never studied any of these subjects and have like never exhibited any interest in them before. It's quite, that's one of the things that Socrates questions. He says, "Well, have you ever actually spent any time studying? Who are the experts in education that you studied under?" Oh, well, none.
Yeah.
Like, it kind of looks like you're not even interested in the subject. So why would you now be advising the whole of society on education policy? Like, I mean, those questions are as relevant today as they were in the past. I think Socrates would say, some people might disagree with me about this, but my impression is that Socrates would say the democratic system might work um, as long as the members of the assembly are not swayed by rhetoric easily, and they're able to think critically and rationally. I don't know that they need to be perfectly wise, but they need to be making progress, presumably towards wisdom and capable, like, of dialectical reasoning, basically, or questioning things, like, and looking beyond appearances. But Socrates obviously looked around him and saw that juries in Athens and the political assembly were very uncritical in their thinking, and they were often swayed by personalities. I mean, there are flaws in the democratic system that were exploited in ancient Athens more and more and more with each year that passes until they were, I would put it like this, that they reached a point where they were being maximally exploited. It went from being a kind of small problem, like that the electorate of the assembly were being manipulated emotionally, to being the main thing that people did, like with the rise of what we call the demagogues, like Cleon, and then professional sophists and orators getting increasingly involved in politics. So, I mean, to begin with, in the time of Pericles, to some extent, People would propose some policy, and then the assembly would people would debate it in front of the assembly and say, well, I think there are pros and cons to doing this. So I don't think it's a good idea. And then the assembly would vote on it. And by the time of Cleon, somebody would say, I think, we should do this or that. And Cleon would say, well, I think that you're a traitor and a criminal. And he'd start attacking people's characters, and ridiculing them in front of the assembly, which I don't know. I don't tend to comment that much on modern politics, but it seems to me that I think partly because of the rise of social media, modern politics, I get the impression, is mainly consists of character attacks and this kind of manipulative rhetoric. During the recent US presidential campaign, at least on social media, and on the bits of mainstream media that I saw, they seem obsessed with attacking people's character and not really saying that much about policies and evaluating them critically. So you can imagine in the early days of democracy, people thought this is a forum for having debate about public health and about the economy and about military strategy and stuff like that. And then it ended up just being a circus
Mhm.
where, everyone was accusing everyone else of corruption, and attacking their character and things like that, and trying to make the assembly members scared or angry, scapegoating foreigners because that's easy, and making people greedy, and manipulating them. Because when people are angry, or in particular, but also when they're scared or when they start to get greedy, they're easy to manipulate, like sheep, And the demagogues realized that, and that was, what they did. And Socrates thought the amount of influence these people have is totally disproportionate to their level of knowledge or expertise. Cleon knows absolutely zero about military strategy. He'd never served in the military. And yet now he's been elected a general. And he ended up responsible for two disastrous military campaigns, both of which Socrates fought in, at Delium and Amphipolis, where Cleon eventually died. So the main demagogue, he ended up having all this, the influence over the military as it happened, but no knowledge or understanding. And a good example actually would be in ancient philosophy, we get this distinction between appearance and reality that's become very simple, very fundamental to philosophy in general, including Socratic philosophy. And Pericles was the type of leader who would say things that were unpopular, but he had such authority, like an ability to present coherent arguments, that he would win people over um, by reasoning with them, and explaining the strengths and weaknesses. He could win people round to the things that they seemed unpopular at first. And the most famous example of that was that in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians had a very powerful navy, the Spartans had a very powerful infantry, and Pericles said when the Spartans would invade Attica, the area surrounding Athens, every year, and Pericles said we mustn't fight them on the land. We should retreat inside the walls of our city, and we're going to have to suck it up and watch them as they burn all of your farmland to the ground, and loot the buildings in the surrounding area, which is horrifying, to the Athenians. But Pericles said I can tell you the strengths and weaknesses of our military, and we're not going to defeat the Spartans in a pitched battle because their infantry is stronger than ours, right? We have to retreat within the walls of the city and suck it up and wait it out. And then when they leave, we'll launch our navy against their allies, and that's how we're going to beat them over time. We'll wear them down, by building alliances, using our navy against them. But they're going to keep attacking our farmland and burning it, and we just have to put up with that. And that was an incredibly unpopular strategy, but arguably it was a solid strategy that was based on a genuine understanding of the comparative strengths and weaknesses of the different military. And that's the sort of thing that I think Socrates would think that a good leader would be able to do. But then when Cleon came along, he reversed that strategy and said, let's go out and attack the allies of the Spartans anyway. the Boeotians, and the Athenians, were defeated because they didn't have enough troops to do it effectively. To cut a long story short, so really. So what Socrates thought is what's missing is somebody who's capable of genuinely studying the strengths and weaknesses of a policy, discussing it rationally, and making an informed decision on that basis, even if at first it appears like a bad idea, it seems like an unpopular thing to do. They can reason with us. It would be like taking an unpleasant medicine. Like a good physician should be able to explain to you, this is going to taste horrible, and maybe you're even going to feel worse temporarily, but ultimately it's going to make you better, right? And Socrates says like a wise person, an expert, somebody who can persuade you the initial appearances are misleading and reality is slightly different. Whereas sophists and orators just deal in feelings and impressions, and famously, as you'll see I mentioned in the book, Socrates compared the orators and sophists to confectioners.
Mm.
Um, he said a physician who's an expert in nutrition studies human health, like Pericles studied the military. And a physician would prescribe a diet to you. He would tell you not to eat certain things that you think taste really nice. And he'd tell you sometimes maybe to eat things that taste bland or don't taste nice because they're good for your health, right? Based on his knowledge and his research on anatomy and physiology and medicine, right? Um, Whereas a confectioner would come up with recipes and with no interest whatsoever in whether they're good or bad for your health. His only criterion for deciding whether a recipe is a good recipe or a bad recipe is how much you approve of it. So if you go, wow, that tastes amazing, like you're giving him a round of applause or whatever, he'll give you more. And he's just adapting what he's doing based on the approval that he gets from his customers. And so Socrates said the sophists and the demagogues are like confectioners. Like they're only interested in whether you like the sound of what they're saying. They're pandering. Confectioners pander to your tastes, regardless of whether what they're doing is good or bad for your health. Like, these politicians are just pandering to your prejudices. Like, if you're really angry, they're going to tell you more angry stuff. Like, if you're really scared, they're going to tell you more frightening stuff and things that are consistent with your biases. Um, and so Socrates thought that was extremely dangerous. And in
Mm.
a way, the Socratic method, I think a lot of people maybe don't realize that in a sense, the Socratic method evolved in this political climate as a way of helping people to defend themselves against political rhetoric. I mean, and I think that's partly why people are interested in it again so much today, because for sure, like most people feel like they're drinking from an absolute fire hose of nonsense on social media that kind of degenerates more and more. I mean, it seems to me anyway that social media has got crazier as time goes on.
So perhaps they
And
should read your book, and that would maybe be one of the cures for modern politicians to study ancient philosophy. Yes,
I
and
think
your
before that, we have to study it,
yeah.
we have to study the Socratic method and philosophy and dialectic in order to defend ourselves against the propaganda and rhetoric that we're being subjected to on a
Uh,
minute by minute basis. I used to say, if you wanted to hear political rhetoric, you used to have to leave your house, right? You used to
yes,
have to walk to the Pnyx, and stand on the side of a hill in order to listen to some crazy demagogue trying to whip up fear and paranoia,
yes,
right? Now you don't. They follow you around. They're in your house, right? With the
yes.
invention of the radio, they came in our living rooms. They're in your pocket now on your mobile phone. It beeps every few minutes with some notification about a
Yeah.
news article from a crazy demagogue that's trying to whip up fear and anger and exploit prejudices. I mean, so that's one of the things I think if Socrates came in a time machine, he'd say, he would say, Wow, like you've invited the sophists into your home. You carry them around with you everywhere you go. Like, I mean, it used to
Yeah,
be we had to go out to see them.
yeah. And on that topic, we also have a couple of questions from listeners that nicely ties with what we've been talking about. We have a question from Mike, and he asks, through the process of writing this book, were there any Socratic teachings that particularly resonated with you or changed your perspective on modern life?
Hmm. Yes, I think so. I mean, I've been reading the Socratic dialogues. I'm kind of we're familiar with them for a pretty long time. I mean, this makes me feel old now, right? I'm getting old, but I started reading these things like 3 decades ago. Um, so like that makes it a little bit harder for me to pinpoint new insights that derive from them. But I did change my mind as I was reading these dialogues again and looking at them from different perspectives. The one that really always sticks with me is the first Alcibiades. I mean, this thing, quite enigmatic thing. Socrates says many, many puzzling and enigmatic things. So he says to Alcibiades, have you heard this saying, know thyself? And Alcibiades, he often brings this up. And Alcibiades is like, well, yeah, like, I mean, but I thought, you know, everybody knows themselves already. Like, it's kind of, pointless saying. Um, and Socrates said to him, I imagine that the god, Apollo, whose temple this is written in Delphi, meant it almost as if he was suggesting that the eye should see itself. The wisdom consists in knowing yourself. Um, Wisdom consists in being figuratively an eye that somehow sees itself. In other words, why doesn't your eye see itself? Because you have a blind spot, right? Like a camera has a blind
Yeah.
spot. Alcibiades would say, well, you have to look in a mirror, like to see your eyes. And Socrates says, well, what would be the mirror for the human mind or the soul? And what he's getting at, I think, is that Socratic dialogues would be the best mirror for the human soul. Like engaging in a deep conversation with another human being. Um, Now, what struck me about that is at first it seemed like a slightly odd, it's a difficult idea and a slightly odd idea, but at another level, it was the most familiar thing in the world to me because I thought there's a sense in which Socrates isn't just a philosopher, because there's a sense in which philosophers didn't exist as they do today in the ancient world. Um, because over time, and particularly following the Industrial Revolution, we have this phenomenon in society called division of labor, and people are divided into different vocations and different professions. And philosophers and psychotherapists today have very little in common. They're two completely different professions, but psychotherapy existed in the ancient world and it wasn't distinct from philosophy. Like in many different disciplines, were all considered just to be one aspect or different aspects of learning or philosophy. Um, and Socrates is not standing delivering lectures or
Mm.
writing books like a modern academic philosopher would. He doesn't do the same thing all day long. He engages in dialogues with people which are much more like what a coach or a counselor or a psychotherapist actually does on a day-to-day basis. And I thought what Socrates is saying is strangely familiar to me. Um, because the reason that I often think to myself, what's the point of psychotherapists? Couldn't we just, often, of course, over time you start to think, couldn't we just get rid of them all? Like it's a tempting idea. Like, could we not get rid of all these life coaches and psychotherapists? And then I think maybe we need them for something.
Yes.
Like, because we have blind spots, and the best mirror for a human soul is another human being that's willing to engage in a very authentic, uh, sincere conversation with us that questions some of our very deep, most deeply held assumptions about some of the most important things in life. And, maybe that's the value that having another human being brings. As people often put it, they say the coach, the therapist brings an external perspective, or they bring objectivity, or they hold a mirror up to the client. But that's what the Socratic dialogues do as well, you know. And so sometimes when Socrates is talking about the dialogues, I think he sounds to me like a psychotherapist or a life coach in certain regards.
I think
Like,
you even would describe him as a grandfather of psychotherapy in
yeah.
your book, which is of yeah, and we have maybe one of the final questions from Hannah that ties with the topic of psychotherapy, and she asks, "Do you think that we would have had some of the popular therapy methods we currently have without some of the ancient philosophers like Socrates?"
Well, I was just going to say that I think that was one of the things that I underestimated
Yes.
over time, and that changed as I was reading the Socratic dialogues more and more. Was I had always seen a connection with psychotherapy, but I deepened that appreciation of the parallels with psychotherapy as I read them again. Would we have? No.
Interesting.
Like I mean, so I'll say something that I know is going to probably seem controversial to some people, but it's my view. I think we underestimate how radically ahead of their time Socrates and the Stoics were, because we have cognitive behavioral therapy now. But when I was young, like cognitive behavioral therapy had been around for decades, but it was only just beginning to become mainstream. And there were still people like that we have psychodynamic therapy today, but there were more people 30 or 40 years ago who were more into Freudian analysis and Jungian analysis and stuff like that, and kind of various spin-offs of them. For how long? Um, Over half a century, like I don't know, around about 70 years or whatever. The Freudian approach really dominated psychiatry and psychotherapy. And Freud's perspective bears no resemblance to the more philosophical therapeutic approach that we find in Socrates and the Stoics. And I mean, just to be clear about this, some people think that Freud invented psychotherapy. I hear that sometimes. That's just completely and utterly, that's not true. Like, it's false. I mean, for a start, Freud trained in psychotherapy himself in Paris under Charcot at the Salpêtrière, and also in a place called Nancy in France under Hippolyte Bernheim, for instance. So psychotherapy was already established in the modern world for around about half a century before Freud even came along, right? He's just the most famous psychotherapist of the 20th century. But even, psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. I know that surprises some, people because, we kind of think they had philosophy and stuff like that in the ancient world. And then it was, maybe a load of superstition and stuff, but they didn't have like modern disciplines. They had psychotherapy in the ancient world. They don't call it psychotherapy, but they come within a hair's breadth of calling it that.
Hmm.
I mean, there may even be some texts that I've not come across where they actually do call it something like that, but they call it therapy of the psyche, which is, as close as you could get, basically. Marcus Aurelius, at the beginning of the Meditations, literally said that from Junius Rusticus, his main Stoic mentor, he received therapia. There's the Greek word for therapy, right? As he literally refers to having Stoic therapy at the beginning. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote a famous book called On Therapeutics. Galen, that book is lost, but Galen, Marcus Aurelius's physician, who is a know-it-all and a prolific intellectual, but not a Stoic, he's more of an eclectic thinker, wrote a book called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul's Passions, which still exists and was inspired by earlier Stoic writings on therapy. On the diagnosis, so on psychopathology, and cure or therapy of the soul's passions, like on psychopathology. It's clearly a book on psychopathology and psychotherapy, and referring back to much earlier texts on the subject. So the main difference is that the Socratic and Stoic tradition is cognitive. Like they have a conceptualization of emotion that says that your emotions are based to a greater extent than you normally assume on your underlying beliefs. And I don't know how we ever lost sight of that. Freud didn't have that idea. Jung didn't have that idea. We underestimate how important that was and how much it had been lost sight of because we forget that only 50 years ago or a little bit more than that, psychotherapy was dominated by people that lacked that. insight. And then we have what's called the cognitive revolution sometimes in psychotherapy. When people rediscovered the Stoic perspective, and that is the beginning of evidence-based practice in modern psychotherapy. Like it really takes off because people start to realize that by identifying the underlying beliefs and questioning them using Socratic questioning, we can change our emotions, and mental health problems like depression and anxiety disorders can be cured or significantly alleviated in many cases, in the majority of cases, by using a kind of variation of the Socratic method, basically. It's amazing how far ahead of the time the Stoics and Socrates were in that regard. The Stoics are the school of all the schools of philosophy. The reason I'm interested in them is the other ones that take this aspect of Socrates and really develop it, really focus on it. So the Epicureans and the skeptics and the Platonists and Aristotelians have these therapeutic ideas, but the Stoics are much more interested in philosophical therapy than any of the other schools and have far more to say about the subject. We have one Stoic text on psychotherapy that is complete and survives today, arguably, and that's Seneca's On Anger, which is an entire book on Stoic psychotherapy for anger, which still exists. You read that today, there's not that many things in it that a modern cognitive behavioral therapist would be surprised by. It's remarkable how, I mean, it's phrased in a very different sort of way, but it's remarkable how consistent it is with the sort of advice that we would give someone today about managing anger.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. And if you're interested in reading more about Socrates, this is I'm not sure if I can. Yes, this is Donald Robertson's latest book, How to Think Like Socrates, and it's coming out in the UK tomorrow. So you can
Ah,
pre-order
okay.
today already, or you can wait a few hours and after midnight you can you can order it. So it's been an absolute pleasure. We've learned so much. So thank you so much for joining us, and we always learn something new from you. So it's always exciting to see how philosophy is applicable today. So it's absolutely amazing. And for those of you who are based in Scotland, we also meet monthly in Edinburgh, where we discuss Stoicism. We meet on the 14th of January next time, so it's on Tuesday next week, and we'll be talking about the importance of community in Stoicism, which is something that maybe also isn't talked about as often as it should. So thank you again very much for joining us. And if you'd like to impart some final wisdom on us, whether it's with regards to community or anything else, we'd love to hear it. And thank you again for your time, Donald.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. The Stoics. One of the big innovations in Stoics of the Stoics is their emphasis on the idea of cosmopolitanism and community. And many people see that as a precursor of the Christian idea of the brotherhood of man and the kingdom of God. So really something that was hugely important in the history of Western civilization. Um, this is one of the major contributions like the Stoics make to our culture. And actually, um, it's one of the reasons I think Stoicism is flourishing in a sense. When we first started doing Stoic Week and Modern Stoicism, I was absolutely something I was wrong about. I was absolutely convinced that within a year or two, we would see Epicurean Week and Aristotelian week. And despite multiple attempts for people to launch popular self-help books on these philosophies and communities based on them, none of these things have ever taken off in the way that Stoicism. I think it's fair to say now, like modern Stoicism has been around for like about over a decade, and none of these other Hellenistic philosophies have captured the popular imagination in the way that Stoicism has. And I think that's partly, it's not the only reason, but partly I think that Stoicism places more emphasis on social virtue and on community, and that has helped. like to some extent, for Stoic communities to flourish online. I think that helps to explain why one of the reasons why it's taken root more than other philosophies.
Thank you very much. So thank you again all for coming. Thank you, Donald, for imparting your wisdom on us, and I wish you lots of eudaimonia in this new year. And until next time, thank you very much. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Bye.